Stanley, a lanky teenager with a mop of brown hair, sat at the picnic table. His family surrounded him. His mother, her face etched with worry lines, fussed over a basket of sandwiches. His father, a sturdy man with calloused hands, stared into the fire, a somber expression on his face. This was their last night in the cabin, their last night together. Tomorrow, Stanley would be sent to live with his aunt, a prospect that filled him with dread. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Stanley picked at his food, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He knew his parents were arguing about him, about what was best for him. He knew they loved him, but he couldn't help but feel like a burden, a problem to be solved. As the fire died down, casting flickering shadows across their faces, Stanley decided to escape the suffocating atmosphere. "I'm going for a walk," he mumbled, pushing himself away from the table. His mother started to protest, but his father silenced her with a look. "Be careful," his father said, his voice gruff with emotion. Stanley nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He plunged into the woods, the darkness swallowing him whole. The trees, tall and imposing, seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, a scent that was both familiar and unsettling. As he walked, he thought about his family, about the uncertainty of his future. He thought about the friends he was leaving behind, the life he had known. He felt a lump forming in his throat, but he forced it down. He wouldn't cry. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. A twig snapped in the distance and Stanley froze. The night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. He listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. Every beat echoed in his ears, amplifying the tension in the air. The sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable, a deliberate movement through the underbrush. It was followed by a low growl, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. The growl was deep, resonating with a primal fear. He told himself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a possum, trying to rationalize the fear creeping up his spine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The sensation of unseen eyes bore into his back. "Dave!" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The name echoed, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Dave was his dog, a scruffy terrier mix who had followed him into the woods. The loyal companion was now his only comfort. Dave whined softly, his tail tucked between his legs. The dog's fear mirrored Stanley's own growing dread. He wasn't usually afraid of anything, and this realization sent a fresh wave of fear through Stanley. The forest felt alive with unseen threats. Stanley turned to leave, but the growl came again, closer than before. It was as if the darkness itself was closing in on him. It was a deep guttural sound filled with menace, the kind of sound that paralyzes you with fear. Stanley's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him. He was frozen in place, his mind racing. Thoughts of escape battled with the paralyzing fear gripping his body. He had to get out of there, and he had to get out of there now. The urgency was overwhelming, pushing him to move despite the fear. He ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced around him. The growl followed him, relentless, echoing through the trees. He could hear Dave close behind him, his claws scrabbling on the forest floor. He didn't dare look back. He didn't want to know what was chasing him. He burst into a clearing, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for mercy. He scanned his surroundings, his heart pounding in his chest. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, the trees around it forming a dark and menacing wall. He thought he saw something move in the shadows, but he couldn't be sure. "Dave," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Dave whined again, this time from behind him. Stanley spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the clearing. He was alone. Dave was gone. Shadows and signs. Panic surged through him. He called out for Dave again, his voice cracking with fear, but there was no answer. Only the sound of his own ragged breathing filled the night air. He stumbled forward, his flashlight beam catching on something lying on the ground. He bent down, his heart sinking as he recognized Dave's collar. It was lying in the middle of a patch of flattened grass, as if something heavy had been dragged through it. Stanley's blood ran cold. He knew then that whatever was out there wasn't any ordinary animal. This was something else, something sinister. He had to find Dave, but a primal fear held him back. He was torn between loyalty and self-preservation. The unseen watcher. He shone his flashlight into the trees again, his hand shaking so badly that the beam danced erratically. He thought he saw a pair of eyes glinting at him from the darkness, but they were gone as soon as he blinked. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine, a feeling of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He was being watched, he was being hunted. The growl echoed again, closer this time, seemingly coming from all directions at once. It was a deeper, more guttural sound than before, vibrating through the air and into Stanley's very bones. It was a sound that spoke of immense power and primal hunger. Suddenly, the trees at the edge of the clearing parted, and a creature emerged from the darkness, its presence sending a chill down Stanley's spine. It moved with an eerie grace, its massive form casting an even deeper shadow over the clearing, as if the night itself was bending to its will. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, fixed on Stanley, and he felt a terror he had never known before grip his heart. The intensity of its gaze was paralyzing, rooting him to the spot. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, a grotesque mockery of nature, as if it had been pulled from the darkest corners of a twisted imagination. Its fur was matted and tangled, its limbs long and sinewy, ending in claws that gleamed like polished obsidian in the moonlight. Each movement it made seemed to defy the natural order. Its head was a mass of sharp angles, its snout elongated and filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, each one looking capable of rending flesh from bone with ease. Stanley stumbled back, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. He had to be dreaming, trapped in some horrific nightmare. It was like something out of a nightmare, a living embodiment of every childhood fear he had ever had. But the guttural growl that emanated from the creature's throat, the stench of decay that clung to it, the sheer terror that clawed at his insides, told him otherwise. This was real, this was happening, and it was coming for him, each step it took bringing it closer, its intentions unmistakably clear. As the creature stalked towards him, its eyes never leaving his, Stanley noticed something peculiar. Hanging from its jaw, partially obscured by the shadows, was a familiar-looking tag. It was Dave's collar. A cold realization washed over him. This wasn't some unknown monster from the depths of the forest. This was Dave, but it wasn't the Dave he knew, the playful, loyal companion who had followed him into the woods. This was something else, something twisted and monstrous. He didn't understand what had happened, what could have transformed his beloved dog into this abomination, but he knew he had to escape. This creature, this thing that was once Dave, was no longer something he could reason with, no longer something he could love. A surge of adrenaline propelled him into action. He turned and ran, his legs pumping furiously, his lungs burning with exertion. He could hear the creature crashing through the undergrowth behind him, its growls echoing through the trees, each one a promise of a gruesome end. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain in his side, the taste of blood in his mouth. He had to survive. He burst out of the woods and into the clearing where his family's cabin stood, the warm glow of the lantern light spilling out into the night. He was almost there. He was almost safe. He slammed into the cabin door, the sound echoing through the night, reverberating through the dense forest. He fumbled with the latch, his heart pounding against his ribs, each beat a reminder of the danger lurking outside. His fingers finally closed around the handle, and he threw the door open, stumbling inside, desperate for the safety he hoped to find within. "Dad, Mom!" he gasped, his voice ragged with fear, echoing through the empty cabin. "Help me! It's Dave! He choked, the words catching in his throat. His words died in his throat. His parents weren't alone. There was an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Standing in the middle of the room, bathed in the flickering light of the lantern, was another creature, its presence dominating the space. It was larger than the one he had just escaped, its fur darker, its claws longer, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce through the darkness, and hanging from its jaws, dripping with saliva, was a child's shoe, a chilling reminder of the danger they were in, a shoe that looked all too familiar, one that belonged to his little brother. Stanley stared in horror, his blood turning to ice, his mind racing with the implications. The creature's eyes met his, and a low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. It took a step towards him, and Stanley knew with a chilling certainty that he was never going to leave these woods alive. The finality of his fate settled over him like a shroud.